From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a weekly Potomac Watch podcast of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. I am here this week with Kevin Roberts, a historian and the president of the Heritage Foundation, obviously a Washington, D.C. think tank, but also the author of a new book, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. Kevin, I know it's a busy time in D.C., so we really appreciate you taking a few minutes to be here.
You are one of my favorite journalists and one of my favorite thinkers, and I'm saying that not just to be the polite Southerner that my mom raised me to be. It's a real pleasure to be with you, friend.
Thank you. I have to begin by asking, obviously, you have been very much in the news this election season and Heritage, although I would wager not always in ways that you or Heritage might have expected or even enjoyed at times. I have to say, when Heritage put out its Project 2025 policy document, I downloaded it and went through it, just as I have done every time Heritage has put out a new version of its mandate for leadership, a tradition that began with the publication of that first iconic mandate back in 1981, written for the Reagan administration. So I think Project 2025 is actually like its 9th edition. So I was somewhat shocked when suddenly I saw the left grabbing this document and claiming it was the roadmap for the Trump presidency, holding it up as the boogeyman of this election. Anyone who has spent any time in Washington knows what this document was about and knew that that was a misstatement. But were you surprised when that happened? And how do you think all that turned out?
Well, I have to say that having been given the charge when I started at Heritage 3 years ago to make conservative think tanks relevant again, we might have succeeded, but in ways that we weren't expecting. And that is to say that, of course, we're very proud of our work since 1980. We've been doing this thing every 4 years. But to your question, Kim, I was surprised. Heritage exists not to take credit. Of course, we're in the news because our policy scholars are smart men and women, and they do a lot of media. But the whole point of that project was to provide personnel recommendations and policies to whomever the next president would be. What we didn't realize is that by doing one thing differently this time around, we would make the project more of a target. And that was in order to help heal some of the fractiousness on the political right. Rather than just make it a heritage product, we invited 110 other organizations to be part of it. That made us a bigger target, all of us, all 111 groups. And we let the left for 4 or 5 or 6 weeks in the late spring get away with their early mischaracterizations of the project. And were I able to rewind the clock, we would have responded then, because at the time, we just didn't think he was much of a threat, because they've never done this kind of thing. All of that to say, ultimately, it didn't work because people are going to the grocery store, paying more for food. Their electric bills are through the roof. They're paying more for gas, and they start to scratch their heads. Why is the Kamala Harris campaign talking about this project from Heritage and these groups? Talk about something that really matters.
Let me jump on something you just said, because I think it's actually a useful, broader question to be discussed here for just a second. You said that when you were brought in to Heritage, it was in part to make conservative think tanks relevant again. Why do you believe they had become irrelevant? What had gone wrong? And you now have said that you believe that this has helped make them relevant again. Is that with regards to policy?
Yes. So, I mean, two things. And look, I'm part of this. So I'm not, sort of passive aggressively throwing stones at some unstated group. I'm a conservative and a movement conservative. So any criticism people hear, it would be at me too. But two things. The first is that I think conservative policy organizations in D.C. and in state capitals had become victims of their own success, that we were able to publish white papers and have smart people do media, and both of those things were good, but that the country was changing in how it received information and therefore in how elected officials were making decisions in Washington and beyond. And the second is sort of piggybacking on that point. We took too long as a movement in recognizing that in as much as we do policy work that is academically oriented, we are also communications operations. And at Heritage, we put both of those goals on almost equal playing field. That is to say, just as the substance is important and will always be our bread and butter, trying to figure out how to message that substance and persuade not just elected officials, but the American people at large is the real frontier that I think conservative organizations have begun to scratch successfully.
On Project 2025 and the policy point, does it hurt the cause of policy, though, in that because of this brouhaha that happened, that President-elect Trump felt compelled to reject Project 2025, to disavow it as something he was interested in? Or is it going to matter more to those who he now chooses for some of these key positions as they are looking for guidance as they go forward?
The best way to understand that situation, and it's a great question, is to understand that when President Trump created that distance, he was telling the truth. I mean, he is running a presidential campaign. We're in the think tank world, but that it was the political season. And that's what he needed to be focused on. And when he and I spoke about it, I was very understanding of that. And he was very not only understanding, but celebratory about the work that Heritage has done for the movement over many decades. But now that we're in the policymaking season, to the heart of your question, Kim, that's what we exist to do. And the early days of the Trump administration are very good as it relates to conservative policy. We're excited about the appointees. We're excited about what we understand to be the policy priorities of the president and vice president-elect. And so while it would be very rational for someone to think that all of the brouhaha about the project harmed the ability to get policy implemented, understanding that brouhaha happened as a result of the political maelstrom, and now we're in the policymaking season, is helpful.
Tell me some of your favorite early picks that he's made so far. Where are you most excited in terms of big change that you think these nominees for some of these key positions could affect?
I like them all. And so I've learned in my 3 years at DC, omission is not an underhanded way of not expressing support. But in the interest of time, I'll talk about 2 or 3. I have to start with my good friend and my Heritage colleague, Tom Homan, appointed as board czar, both because I know and love Tom. I've, in fact, have worked with Tom since I was running Texas Public Policy Foundation prior to joining Heritage. But secondly, you also know how serious we are at Heritage and our concern about the lawlessness at the southern border. And I think Tom is the man to fix that, not just at the border, but as I learned from Tom several years ago, the importance of interior enforcement for securing the southern border. In addition to Tom, I'm also very excited about Senator Rubio, who's a great friend, and to mention a topic that you often write about in a very thoughtful way, and of course Heritage is in the middle of. What I love about Rubio, in addition to being a fellow traveler of the Reagan Revolution, is that he's got one foot in each part of conservative foreign policy thinking, that more sort of, as it's called, traditional foreign policy thinking of conservatives, as well as the more prioritizing restrained part of foreign policy. We at Heritage think that actually those two can inform each other, and I think Rubio will do a great job at state. And finally, I'm really high on the Pete Hegseth pick, having known Pete for a while, but also understanding that the right Secretary of Defense right now is someone who is a rank-and-file veteran, who understands the building, understands there needs to be reform. Reform not for the sake of saying that we're reforming, but reform for the sake of making it once again, our military once again, the most lethal fighting force in the history of the world that is used sparingly and constitutionally.
So I'm glad you mentioned that last name, because obviously there's been a lot of controversy. What do you say to those? Because you say you know him as someone who does. What do you say to those who are concerned simply that this is a person that, yes, he is a veteran, absolutely, but has not had prior experience in that world in a managerial position at the Pentagon? This is one of America's largest workforces. I mean, the logistical questions alone are astounding to behold, not to mention the many, many problems that you have just pointed out. So I guess one of the questions I think a lot of people have, including some senators who are going to be making a decision on this nomination, is simply the question of experience.
Fair question. 3 things. First of all, in addition to being a veteran, Pete is one of the brightest people I've ever met. That exclusively doesn't qualify someone to be Secretary of Defense, but I understand that his approach to the reform of the Department of Defense, moving on to a second point, isn't, as Heritage is calling for at the U.S. Department of Education, a total elimination of it. Obviously, that's a very different cause than what the new secretary will have at defense, but understanding that we continue to spend far too much money on outdated munitions programs. Frankly, because they're politically popular in some districts. And we have to be able to cut through that for the sake of not just our military men and women, but also for the sake of peace through strength. Pete, as a rank and file veteran, as opposed to a 3 or 4 star general who unfortunately is more likely to be infected by the woke mind virus, is going to be a more effective Secretary of Defense. And finally, I'm convinced of that because Pete has an executive's profile, just like Donald Trump. He's going to hire good men and women as his deputies and undersecretaries. He would be the first to say, he's never run the Pentagon. It is a job with astonishing scale and political intrigue. It will require a lot of savvy, which he possesses. In other words, there is a messaging component to the next Secretary of Defense's job that I think Pete is qualified for eminently. And I would encourage our friends in the Senate to spend some time talking about that, because if they've got concerns about a supposed lack of experience or, maybe a misalignment, I actually think that those possible qualms will be put to rest pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's going to be some very interesting hearings coming up here.
Oh, my God.
You just said a couple of words that another issue here of Donald Trump picks. You said cutting through as you were talking about some of these, allegiances to maybe outdated systems, stuff that needs to change. How excited are you about Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk, Doge project? And in particular, are there some things that Heritage has in its policy manual that might speak to their plan of both cutting and efficiency? Because it strikes me that both of those things are on the table here. And that's fascinating to me because obviously a lot of the big, easy plucking is just to say, well, we should shut down this program or that program. But as you and I both know, that's going to take congressional buy-in. Some of those decisions are a little harder to get over the finish line. The efficiency question, though, seems to me to have endless possibility. It's a little bit more boring for people, a little harder to get their heads around, right? This is procurement, right? Or as you said, embedded programs that have constituencies that you have to unpry from them. But where do you think the real traction might be in this effort? Efficiency is the key word. And as you said, talking about or focusing on procurement processes is boring, but maybe that's why at a think tank where I guess some people think we do boring work, we're very excited about all of this because that's what we see. In fact, my great colleagues in our fiscal policy and economic shops are thrilled, as I am, by the appointments of Elon and Vivek to that role. And they quickly, I don't even think it took them an hour. In a matter of minutes, Kim, I asked them, I said, guys, we will likely be asked to make some recommendations here. Where do you start? And they said, Kevin, remember, every year Heritage publishes our federal budget policy blueprint. And this almost sounds fantastical for me to say this, Kim, but I know we agree on this mightily. We still want a balanced federal budget. Well, we're now well into the mid or late 2030s when we think this is possible. But what we map out in that product is a series of steps, certainly a few eliminations or program eliminations, but mostly layups, mid-range jumpers, if I may, of efficiency and really focusing on procurement. I think, we know there could be $1 trillion in savings just in doing that. $1 trillion. Wow. Yes. That's the level of inefficiency in this government. By the way, over a 5-year period, I should say. The math will make more sense now. Okay.
Yeah, we're looking at this in sort of 5-year political horizons as well. But the important part of doing this is that they need to get ahead of steam. So they've got to hit some layups early on so that people don't think that this is some sort of silly intellectual exercise. But I also think that will give people, regular, ordinary Americans, the potential to trust their government some more. That's an aspect of this effort that I think is really vital, because right now it isn't just that Americans think government is too expensive, that it does some goofy things. They actually think that it might be unreformable. Yeah, I definitely come across that view very much. And I want to, at the very end, I want to talk to you a little bit about the divide out there between the federal government and state initiatives and state think tanks, too, some of the work that's going on there. But we're going to take a break. When we come back, more with Kevin Roberts.
Welcome back. I am Kim Strassel here with All Things and All Things this week with Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation. Let's talk a little bit about your book, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. It was just published this past week. Congratulations. I know how painful it can be to bring a book to life. I actually do compare it to childbirth. Every time I write a book, I say I will never do that again. And then, some time passes and before you know it, you are once again with child. But it's an ideas book, a theory for what's gone wrong and what institutions average Americans need to reclaim, or as you say, to burn, although I think you mean that very much in a metaphorical cleansing sort of way. I just want to clarify something myself. As you noted, we are both friends here. You say in the description of the book, you call out, and these are your words, so-called conservatives, who you say are as culpable as Democrats for bringing America to the brink of destruction. And then you announce the arrival of what you call a new conservative movement. Capital N, capital C, capital M. Can you explain that to me? Who are the so-called conservatives and what makes for a new conservative movement? Because I have to be honest with you, I'm a conservative and I'm not necessarily sure I'm convinced I need to be drawn into a new movement.
I love your skepticism.
My conservatism is working just fine for me right now.
Your intellectual rigor is fantastic. What I mean by so-called conservatives, and look, I played basketball and sometimes had sharp elbows, so that's intentional. It is intended to be provocative, would be Washington establishment Republicans who continue to tell us that the country is fine, that we can continue to spend money that we don't have, that we can spend $200 billion, for example, on Ukraine, which is a noble cause, protecting sovereign territory, for which we've had no process, or at least a very small process in figuring out whether it's even wise. And so I'm saying that what we're trying to do at Heritage is bring together Reagan conservatives, Bush conservatives, with new conservatives. And I think that there has been sort of a knee-jerk reaction by some Washington Republicans against the so-called new right that is short-sighted. And, our mantra at Heritage is to add and multiply. And so what we're trying to do, from foreign policy to spending to the usage of the federal government, which of course we're very skeptical of, is bring them all together. It's challenging. It's difficult. It can be painful. And you take slings and arrows. But we also believe, as I think we have talked about before, that the country in 2024 is weaker by every objective measure I can conjure than it was, say, in 1984. Saying that doesn't mean that the future is going to be doom and gloom. In fact, we think quite the opposite. But we do have to acknowledge that some things have to change about our politics, not just nationally in a presidential election, but perhaps also within the conservative movement toward, to sum up here, Kim, toward a policy program that reflects some of the messaging that you heard from Donald Trump and J.D. Vance in terms of being more working class oriented, family oriented. We think that serves the movement and the country better.
So I can totally agree with the notion that we could all afford to be a little bit bolder and engage in more change. I guess one question I have, and I guess I would just one more on this because I'm going to push back here just a little bit.
Sure.
You talk about the new Republican right. And here's my issue with that, which is just that when I see some of the policies that are put forward by that new conservative right, and that's what they call themselves. So they are anti-business in some ways. They are pro-bigger government in that they support subsidies as long as they are subsidies for causes that they believe in. For instance, childbearing or handouts to child care centers. They're in favor at times of more regulation, drug price controls, as long as it's to beat up corporatism. They're in favor of breaking bread with unions, the very unions who strip workers of a lot of their freedoms. And I don't necessarily see that as new. Like, my word for that is Rockefeller Republicans, and that's what Reagan came to Washington to get rid of, isn't it?
I think for some people on the new right who are enamored with labor unions, et cetera, I think that is historically accurate. What I'm talking talking about in the book and what we're working on at Heritage is something different, however. And so let me home in on two policy areas, one where I suspect we agree mightily and one where we'll probably agree to disagree as friends. The first is on corporatism. And I explicitly will take speaking engagements in the country and around the world with New Right conferences to make the following point to them. If what you're decrying as the excesses of the free market, speaking to them, is actually what I see, and that is the collusion of big government and big business, then what you're arguing against is not business or the free market, but corporatism, as you said. And so let's call it what it is, and let's work on that and improve
corporate welfare.
Corporate welfare. Yeah, corporate welfare. And I think that has, not because I've said it, but because this movement is maturing, I think there's a growing awareness of that. But the second point, where you're talking about subsidies for childcare, Heritage has a white paper coming out soon, late this fall, early this winter, in which we will be arguing that there is a federal role in playing a partial role in arresting the declining birth rate and marriage rate. We do not argue that, A, we have all of the answers yet. We're analyzing this still. Or B, that is the end-all, be-all. But we do believe that it's appropriate, even in the conservative movement, to be having that conversation. We understand fully, Kim, that friends in the movement, perhaps yourself included, disagree. But we do believe that this conversation has to be part of the conservative issue set. I'm convinced that if Reagan were here, he would say, yes, let's have that conversation. Our spirit at Heritage is to say, just as we did in a reset toward a more hawkish China policy, we're going to be researching this over the next few years, gleaning what we can from other societies around the world that have had modest success, and see if there is some formula here in the United States, whether using the federal government and or using state governments to have some success.
Okay, we can agree to disagree that I don't want to be hungry, but we will move on to new things. I know that's where you're going with this. We'll be back after one more break with Kevin Roberts.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back once again here with Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation. I do want to ask you, too, you get into some of the institutions that you say need burning. And again,
metaphorically,
more metaphorically, meaning like, again, and I liked it, you were talking about natural forest fires and the need to kind of cleanse the environment for renewal, as it were. And I thought that was a very nice way to put it. I think a lot of these groups that you name in the book, the FBI, for instance, Department of Education, Ivy League colleges, would make a sense to a lot of people. There are a couple you threw in there that I would wager would surprise people a little bit more. I'm going to throw a few out there. You explain why they need the metaphorical burn, in particular, the Boy Scouts and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the New York Times.
I'll go in reverse order. The New York Times has great people working at it. I wish them well. But the New York Times as an institution is a den of vipers and a bunch of liars who tell us that there was Russia collusion, who go out of their way repeatedly to lie, not just about Donald Trump, but about the people who support him. That's an institution that needs to be regenerated. On the Boy Scouts of America, I am not just a proud Eagle Scout, but the Boy Scouts of America, as I talk about in the book, was instrumental in my overcoming real childhood problems in my family, which many Americans face. And I find it reprehensible that it's not even called the Boy Scouts of America anymore. Nothing against girls. I'm a dad of 3 daughters, but there are other institutions, not just for young ladies to get good formation and leadership, but also the Boy Scouts of America, scouting as it's called now, has been infected by the woke mind virus. These are institutions that represent the social and cultural deterioration in values, but that are also extremely cowardly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I do recommend people get this book and read it. It's got some very fascinating thoughts in it. It certainly made me think. A last question, Kevin, because it rounds back to something you were talking about in terms of progress around the country. We as conservatives obviously deeply believe in the idea of the republic, right? And, you know, not so long ago, well, I guess actually in real terms, it was a long time ago, but you go back about 100 years, the vast vast majority of governance, as it was done in the states, not in Washington, D.C. Those were the days Milton Friedman extolled. Taxes at a state level were higher than what you paid in federal taxes because the state had so much more responsibility over some of these issues and some of these questions. How do you balance that out? You are the head of a national think tank based in Washington, D.C., designed to give the federal government information. Yet we are seeing this kind of flourishing, especially in certain policy areas out in the states. I mentioned, for instance, school choice is a great one, licensing reform. There have been some really great tax reforms out in the state. When you guys get together, how much of what I'm just fascinated by this idea does Heritage is about actually returning from a policy perspective some of this back out to the states, even though that could mean you guys had less of a job to do in D.C.?
Well, that would be glorious. You actually just described my political love language, which is state-based work. And that perhaps makes sense, having cut my teeth as a policy leader in Texas at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. But let me speak real specifically about what Heritage is doing there. When I got to Heritage a few years ago, Heritage had just for the first time started in a direct way the legislative advocacy that so many other groups do. And we do that in complement to the state-based groups. We were doing that in election integrity. We now have state lobbying teams in 30 states, Kim. And what we're doing is taking a smaller set of issues than what we work on in D.C., which is everything, and focused on taxation, education choice, some other economic policies, and coordinate with the state-based groups so that we can revitalize federalism in this country. In other words, bottom line up front, we would be very happy if we have less work to do in D.C. because we've made that government smaller, not just from Trump's executive orders and maybe the occasional good legislation passed by Congress, but most importantly, as I emphasize in the book, because state policy groups, state legislatures, governors are saying, in order to have a flourishing republic, we have to rebalance the power, the authority between states and the federal government. That actually is what success looks like.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your book. Thank you to our listeners. If you like the program, we are here every week and you can hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at pwpodcast@wsj.com.